On the News Channel 5 network, this is Inside Politics.
Hello, everyone. I'm News Channel 5's political analyst, Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. The entire nation, as well as the state of Tennessee and of Nashville, are trying to come to grips with what's been the worst week of racial discord in this country since the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King 52 years ago in 1968. Our guest this week's on Inside Politics are longtime Tennessean editor and reporter Dwight Lewis and Nashville historian David Ewing. We've asked them both to join us so they can put in perspective what's happening, both in terms of history and of where we are now and what may lie ahead. Gentlemen, welcome back to the program, and thank you for being with us. The national uproar that began, Dwight, was over the asphyxiation death of George Floyd. He was an unarmed African-American who was killed by 4 Minneapolis police officers. They've all been fired and arrested. One is facing second-degree murder charges. The other 3 are facing aiding and abetting murder charges. Dwight, there's been a lot of unfortunate situations where African-Americans have been killed by law enforcement in recent years. What is it about the George Floyd state that has galvanized and incited such a furor?
Pat, I think that one of the major facts is that it was videotaped and people could see what was happening. There were people present. A lot of times incidents happen at night or nobody is around when somebody is beaten up by police or law enforcement officers. But this time people were standing by. And it was there for the whole, not only for those of us in the United States, but for the whole world to see.
So, David, we're seeing a big impact with what's going on now, with what's going on with social media. That social media wasn't around when, and people didn't have phones on their hip to be able to videotape things in 1968 when Dr. King was killed. Now it's a whole new ballgame in terms of finding out what's actually going on.
One of the things that I think I agree with Dwight about, this event kind of went viral because we were all at home watching, because a lot of people are still working at home from the pandemic. So normally you'd be at work or doing other things, but people have been glued in front of their TVs for months watching Netflix and news. And so I think that also made the story even bigger. And of course, as you said, social media, it just spread.
Dwight, we're also all at home because of what's happened with the coronavirus. It's killed 100,000 people. A disproportionate number are probably African American. That, along with a huge rise in unemployment because we shut down the economy to fight the virus, again, disproportionately impacting African Americans. What did the virus and this unemployment do with also galvanizing the situation?
Well, I think it tells us that blacks and people of color are suffering more. And we need to be involved in getting things changed. And I think the murder, the killing that took place in Minneapolis just stirred it up. People said, I can't sit down. I can't keep sitting down on my fanny.
David, another issue that may come out of this is that people are out marching. They're not necessarily social distancing. They're not wearing masks. Is one of the outcomes of this in a couple of weeks going to be a second wave of the virus? Will that be part of the legacy, an unfortunate legacy that may come out of this as well?
I think it will. We know from even the 1918-1919 pandemic that it spreads person to person. And social distancing has worked and has kept the numbers even lower in certain areas, including Tennessee. But, when you have thousands of people marching, not only here, but all over the country, our protesters were very responsible. It seems like 80% were wearing, or 90% were wearing masks. It's still probably going to have a larger spread than it would have.
Dwight, I want to get back to something you said earlier. I want to quote the movie Network, where one of the protagonists in it, but I'm putting this down in cases of both blacks and whites across the country. Are we seeing a lot of people in general with this saying, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore?
I think we're seeing a lot of people say that. But I also think that people are fed up. And you mentioned earlier, the President of the United States, I think he's played a major part in this. And the Senate, the U.S. Senate, we see the Senate just railroading federal judges into office. And I think people just said, we can't, we've been angry when some of these incidents take place, but now we just got to do something about it. And people said, I'm gonna get up and go out and let my voice be heard.
1968 was also a presidential year, David, and it actually ended up being it was an open seat that year, but Richard Nixon won. He was the law and order president. So President Trump is talking about wanting to dominate the streets to be the law and order president. How is this going to play in the white community versus how dominating the streets is going to play among the protesters out in the street?
And I think the rules have changed. And you talked about being mad as hell. The African American community have been mad as hell since Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, and Rodney King. This is nothing new. Been going back to the 19th century. And we learned from the 1960s and John Lewis and Diane Nash how to protest. So even kind of a law and order kind of get tough attitude, that's not going to stop peaceful protest, because peaceful protest worked here, worked a lot of other places in the South.
Dwight, as a reporter and an editor for a long time in Tennessee, and you covered a lot of tense situations. Of what you've seen lately and what's been going on TV, the pictures of the fires, the looting, the arson, the curfew here in Nashville, and the National Guard being activated in many states, have you had any flashbacks this week that you're back in the 60s again?
Well, Pat, I was here at Tennessee State. I stayed on campus. I was on campus, living on campus in 1967 when the riots took place, and a lot of people want to blame Stokely Carmichael, who had spoken at Vanderbilt CMPAC earlier that Saturday afternoon, and riots started that night. And then in 1968, I was standing down on Jefferson Street, next to the Jefferson Street Missionary Baptist Church, when Dr. King was assassinated and the riots took place. And I remember living in Kennedy Apartments, and one night we heard something going up the street, and we thought we were coming down the street, coming down Jefferson. We thought we couldn't look out windows. We thought we were about to be killed. It was an Army tank. Somebody had set the ROTC building at Tennessee State on fire, and a National Guard tank was coming down Jefferson Street, and the sound of it, just the terrible sound, knew you were about to be killed. So seeing some of the demonstrations, and especially the looting and the violence taking place, makes me think back to 1968.
David, as a historian looking back on what's happening today, we also saw in the last week the first American astronauts to blast off into space from this country in over a decade, about a decade. The space program, particularly back in the 60s when we were trying to get to the moon, was a unifying force. Has that kind of gotten lost over the years? Has that become a secondary issue, particularly for people who feel like they're not being listened to?
Everything has gotten bumped off the front page, including the coronavirus this past week. I mean, people are glued to this George Floyd story, the marches, the outrage, the response, and it's almost like the virus is it hasn't gone away, but based on the wall-to-wall coverage that we've had over the last few months, it's been bumped off the first page.
David Ewing, Nashville historian, and Dwight Lewis, longtime editor and reporter at the Tennessean, are our guests. We're talking about the events of the past week in terms of civil unrest across the country and here in Nashville. Back to continue our conversation after this break.